The non-tender deadline is coming up in Major League Baseball. Is there anyone the Cardinals are going to cut from the roster? Coming up on B Schaeffer Daily. What's going on, everybody, and welcome in to this edition of B Schaeffer Daily. Brenden Schaeffer here with you. It is the morning hours of Tuesday, November 14th, 2023. We've got the Rule 5 protection deadline coming up tonight. I believe it's 5 p.m. Central, 6 p.m. Eastern. The deadline by which the Cardinals and other teams around the game will have to decide which Rule 5 eligible players they want to protect from the draft pool by adding those players to the 40-man roster. The Cardinals, when we recorded, Sunday night, because we didn't record Monday night, we recorded Sunday night for Monday. You listened to that episode yesterday, most likely. The Cardinals had a full 40-man roster last we spoke. There's since been a roster move. We'll talk about that one that's cleared at least one spot. And by the time you listen to this podcast later on Tuesday or on Wednesday, there will certainly be more information that's come out. So stay tuned to B Schaeffer Daily on Spotify and Apple Podcasts. Go ahead and subscribe over there and hit that subscribe button on YouTube for all of our Cardinals content. YouTube.com/@BSchaeffer12. It's the same as my Twitter handle @BSchaeffer12. And the Brenden Schaeffer St. Louis Cardinals writer YouTube channel will be up and rolling all off season and into 2024 as we cover all things Cardinals. So would love you to subscribe. If you happen to already listen to the videos on the channel, make sure to hit subscribe so you never miss one. But we're going to jump right in. I'm going to try to do a better job of that, of getting right to the content of the day. And we'll start with talking about the Wilking Rodriguez move. The Cardinals had Wilking Rodriguez. We talked about him yesterday in the context of the Rule 5 draft. He was actually somebody that they brought in last year via the Rule 5 draft, meaning the Cardinals needed to have kept him on the roster the entire season in order to keep him in the organization. However, Wilking Rodriguez spent the entire year injured. He made a couple of appearances at the end of the season for AAA Memphis on a rehab assignment, basically. So that was allowable, right? Because he had an injury. He was rehabbing with Memphis. But he is now no longer in the Cardinals organization as the transaction on Monday. Cardinals outrighted him to Memphis. So he did clear waivers, which, again, this is a new season, so you're allowed to send him to Memphis at that point. Outright means he's off the 40-man roster. But then it was Rodriguez's decision whether or not he wanted to remain with the Cardinals. And Wilking Rodriguez, I believe, elected minor league free agency, which means he is no longer with the organization. That's according to the transaction report. I'm seeing here Lynn Worthy of the Post-Dispatch tweeted a picture of the Memphis Redbirds' latest transactions, and he elected free agency. So the Wilking Rodriguez era, how will you remember it? He spent a whole year with the Cardinals. He got a year of service time, never threw a pitch for St. Louis. As Jeff Jones pointed out in his tweet yesterday, he caught a few first pitches, as the players often do that are on the lower end of the roster. They go out and catch the ceremonial first pitch. Well, that was about the extent of his action on the field in St. Louis. So Wilking Rodriguez, who, again, we talked about him yesterday, not a young guy. He's like 33 years old, pitched in Mexico for a good long while, had a little bit of major league experience briefly with the Royals in 2014, then went to Mexico. Cardinals like what they saw there, thought they could get something out of him. Hard thrower, but, again, spent the whole season with an injury, and so it just didn't work out. But that puts the Cardinals roster, as of this recording, at 39. And we talked yesterday, Sunday night for Monday's episode, about the players the Cardinals may look to protect for that 40-man roster so that they don't get swiped up in the Rule 5. Scroll back one on your podcast feed or on YouTube if you would like to listen to the discussion about that. But we'll know the answers here within the next 7 or 8 hours as to which players the Cardinals do decide to protect and which will be made exposed and available to other MLB teams in the December 6th Rule 5 draft that will be taking place at the winter meetings in Nashville. But today I want to focus primarily on other ways the Cardinals may look to clear some roster spots, and these could happen today as well. So stay tuned. On Tuesday night, we'll do another episode that you guys can listen to on Wednesday morning, and we may be talking about some non-tenders, because in order to protect any of the players that the Cardinals would like to protect from their organization from Rule 5 eligibility, they'll have to add them to the 40-man, and that means people have to leave the 40-man. And so there could be some non-tender action today. My prediction is that you'll see maybe some of the more understated names, the guys that aren't necessarily in arbitration eligibility, that could potentially be cut on Tuesday to make room for anybody the Cardinals would protect. Although I would say this, like, the vibe I'm getting from reading everybody else's thoughts about Rule 5 protection is that maybe the Cardinals don't protect as many players as I kind of thought they should yesterday. I was looking at Sem Robertson, and not to completely spoil yesterday's podcast, but if you missed it, Sem Robertson and Adam Kloffenstein, which it is Steen, but I kind of joked and said it both ways, Kloffenstein. Those guys both came over in the Jordan Hicks trade. You just acquired those guys, but they're both eligible for Rule 5 if you don't add them now to the 40-man roster. So it would seem a little bit strange for the Cardinals to prioritize getting something for Jordan Hicks and then not adding both of those guys to the 40-man roster. Even if you thought, it's unlikely that they would be scooped up. If that's the case, then I guess they weren't very quality acquisitions to begin with. If you're willing to just let them a couple of months later be exposed to any team for the sum of $100,000, because that's what happens when it's a player taken in the Rule 5 draft. The team, the Cardinals in this case, would get $100,000 cash compensation for those players, and they would have to stay on the major league roster of the other team that selects the player in the Rule 5 draft for the entire upcoming season on the active 26-man roster. And if they do so, then that player is now on the other organization for good. If they don't want to keep him on the active roster, they have to offer the player back to the original team for $50,000 is the way that works. So for me, Sem Robertson, Adam Kloffenstein, they would be no-brainers to add. And I would honestly put Ian Bedell in there as well. But we also have to recognize that the 40-man is pretty full. There's 39 spots filled right now. Granted, I think there's a number of those names that are more likely to just go ahead and clear through waivers and not be selected if you were to take them off the 40-man roster. Some of the guys that were added at the end of the season because you needed players on the active roster when the Cardinals had all those guys on the injured list. There are several names today that I would be removing from the roster. And at the end of yesterday's podcast, I listed like a dozen guys that could be up for discussion or debate. Obviously, I don't think all those guys will be gone, but a number of them probably should and will be today, unless the Cardinals want to play a little bit of a gambling situation with the players they just got at the trade deadline. And Ian Bedell, another name that I mentioned yesterday, I went into more depth. I would definitely recommend going back and listening if you missed it. Ian Bedell, fourth-round pick of the Cardinals out of Mizzou in 2020, only pitched at high A last year because he had Tommy John the year before that, but I feel like Ian Bedell had a really nice season, and I'd like to see what he could do at Double A. Granted, the Cardinals could be looking at that saying, but is an MLB team really going to look at his high A numbers and think, we immediately need to bring him to the big leagues and claim him in the Rule 5 draft? Because that's what you'd have to do, is if you pick him up in the Rule 5 draft, he's on your team next year, your active roster, and he's got to stay there for a full year. So tanking teams could maybe take advantage of some of the younger players that organizations don't have protected, but we'll see what happens with some of the Cardinals guys. Once again, Rule 5 draft, we focused heavily on that yesterday. The deadline, Tuesday, 5 p.m. Central. We'll see if the Cardinals add anybody or take anybody else off to make room. But later on in the week, it is Friday, the non-tender deadline, where you've got arbitration-eligible players. You have to offer them a contract. And it doesn't have to be a contract that they accept, but by offering them the contract, you're saying, we want you on the team for next year. You're eligible for arbitration. So if this contract that we offer you isn't to your liking by Friday, November 17th, then you don't have to accept it. We'll go to arbitration, or we can continue to negotiate throughout the offseason, because those arbitration hearings usually don't take place till like February, January. So there's some time there between now and then. But you have to offer that initial contract by the 17th or make the decision that you're going to do so. And non-tendering a player, which means you do not tender them a contract offer, sends the player directly to free agency without waivers or anything like that. They're just gone. If you don't offer them a contract, that'll end their time with the organization. And that's true not just for ARB-eligible players. I guess I should clarify. You could be a year 1 or year 2 service time guy. You still have to be tendered a contract. You may not know the exact amount of that contract. There's some negotiations and some things that aren't that important to the grand scheme of things for us to talk about here as to exactly what happens with the salary there. But oftentimes it's guys that are ARB eligible and their salaries are going up, and you look at last year's productivity and you say, we really don't think we want to pay what your salary is likely to be through the arbitration process. So that's what we're going to talk about a little bit today. I've got an article from MLB Trade Rumors pulled up because they listed all of the players that they believe have a 10% chance or better of being cut, which is, again, this is pretty subjective, but it gives you a decent idea for some of the names that we'll be talking about who are arbitration eligible, but maybe, according to MLB trade rumors, whoever put this list together, there's a chance that they wouldn't be offered a contract and would instead be allowed to go to free agency. So I'm going to talk about the Cardinals that are on this list. We'll go down the list, starting at the top with catchers, and just work our way down and see how many Cardinals are on this list and whether or not we think there is a legit chance of that player being non-tendered before Friday, November 17th deadline. So once again, want to remind you guys, hit like on this video and subscribe on the channel if you'd be so kind. If you enjoy the Cardinals content, that helps me a lot. But let's go ahead and jump in. At the catcher position, there is a player listed here. Andrew Knizner is listed with a projected $2 million salary in arbitration for the 2024 season. Now, 10% chance of being cut isn't a particularly high rate, so we have to kind of work through the weeds on should this player really be considered likely to be cut. If the salary is in the range of $2.5 million for Andrew Knizner, I would say no, he's going to be tendered a contract before Friday. Now, there is the possibility that the Cardinals would seek a trade because if they decide Wilson Contreras, it seems they've recommitted to him as a catcher for next season. I think you're going to see Yadier Molina join the coaching staff in some capacity, even if that just means special advisor assistant during the season. But during spring training, he's down there working every day with Wilson Contreras. That might honestly be the best thing, is just a catcher boot camp. You want to be the guy that replaces Yadi. Here's how Yadi does it. Yadi can work directly with Wilson. And I know a lot of people don't like how often I talk about the Wilson Contreras kind of deficiencies as a catcher defensively, because you'd say, well, the Cardinals knew what they were getting into. They knew what kind of player Wilson Contreras was. There was plenty of a book out on him. Great hitter, maybe a little subpar defensively, has a good throwing arm to throw out base runners, but maybe the blocking and the framing not as quality as you'd hope for. But again, this is not anything that should have been news to the Cardinals. And I think Wilson is an athletic guy. So can he improve in some of the techniques and things like that from working with Yadier Molina? Yes. Was he the worst catcher in the world? No. I don't think it's even the technical stuff like that the Cardinals would benefit from having Yadier Molina around him for. I think it's more the behind the scenes and almost the preparation stuff. Not that Wilson Contreras wasn't giving effort in his preparation, but maybe Yadier Molina can help him with the efficiency of that prep and like, here's how I would go about it, and just kind of be a resource for him in that way. I feel like sometimes when I bring up the Wilson Contreras stuff, there are some Cardinals fans listening that say, well, I don't like how you're kind of bagging on Wilson. It's not me that's doing it. It's the actions and the words that the Cardinals organization did and spoke throughout 2023 by benching him from the catcher role, right, early in the season. That was a bizarre thing that happened. Do I think Wilson Contreras deserved all of that? No. I think the Cardinals had certain expectations for what it would be like. I think the Cardinals pitching staff is largely to blame for a lot of what happened there, because I think the starting pitchers had expectations of what it would be like because they had worked with Yadi and they had worked with Andrew Knizner. They had not worked with Wilson Contreras, and so there wasn't familiarity there. And it was sort of this, like, you could probably spend a lot of time talking about this, that some of the pitchers, who many of them are gone now, obviously, Flaherty, Montgomery, Wainwright, and I'm not naming even any names. We did talk about how Jordan Montgomery and Wilson Contreras seemed like they would go months at a time without working together as a starting battery. That was always kind of interesting, but there was always like a reason for it or whatever. But I think you can make a case that the pitchers were the driving force behind the benching of Wilson Contreras. And again, the rumors and reports coming out that he would call pitches on the pitch con that the pitcher didn't even throw. I think it was honestly a communication lapse. There was a gap there in the communication and how one side thought things ought to be done and how the other side was comfortable or used to doing them. And so that's not really related to, oh, Wilson, you didn't block this pitch, which, again, he's one of those catchers that does go down to the knee to block a pitch, and that's a more common technique in today's game. I mean, Yadi had done it as well. I don't personally prefer it, but I don't know as much about catching as these guys do. I can't pretend like I know anything more than just watching it and going, oh, my gosh, if he hadn't been on his knee, he might have been in a better positioned to block that. There's probably more that goes into that than I am even aware of, and so to ridicule it with too stern of language would probably be irresponsible on my part. But a lot of baseball fans, I think, agree with me. Like, oh my gosh, this going down to a knee stuff, it's going to make you less adept at blocking pitches. It's not even that, though, that I think is the primary focus. I think it would just be such a benefit to the Cardinals to have Yadi and Wilson in spring training for a full spring training with all the pitching staff, not just half of them because everybody's gone for the World Baseball Classic. And again, it's not an excuse that the Cardinals use, but it's a reality that I think it had an impact on the way they started the season. And then once you get off on the wrong foot, it could be difficult to get it back. I mean, these are all factors in what happened in 2023. But I just think generally having Yadi there, not to make Wilson the whipping boy and say, oh, he can't do it on his own. I'm not infantilizing him, but I think the Cardinals can and will benefit from that. I'm predicting Yadi will be there in spring training at a minimum, whether he's an in-uniform coach during the season or not. I think he'll definitely have a part of it in spring training. But because of the Cardinals' recommitment, and it seems in recent days, again, there was no end-of-season press conference, but I guess Mo has, in whatever media that he did out at the winter meetings, or not the winter meetings, but the GM meetings, it seems that the Cardinals are going to move forward with Wilson. And that makes sense, too. Like, if you're trying to bring in Yadi or Molina, I think that would be one of the major benefits of having Yadi around. So not a surprise that they're going to have Wilson be a catcher. That's what he was signed to do. It's an important part of his value because as a DH with an 800 OPS, you're like, all right, solid hitter. As a catcher with an 800 OPS, you go, that is an advantage over the rest of the league. So there is a lot of a reason as to why he was paid $87.5 million. It wasn't just to be an above-average, really good hitter, which he is. It was to do that from the catching position for a good portion of the time that he plays and then maybe be a DH to get off his feet a little bit during some of the other games throughout the season. But because of that, I wonder what they do at the catcher position because Andrew Knizner had a really nice season for the Cardinals, brought his offense to a level that we hadn't quite seen from him previously, had a 601 OPS in 2022 and raised it better than 100 points to 712 and had a 424 slugging percentage that was a career high as well this past season. 10 home runs in 241 plate appearances, was about a halftime player, played in 70 games, did a really nice job. I feel like that is a guy you want to keep around, but Ivan Herrera did have a nice step forward for the Cardinals in 2023. That was one of the few bright spots, honestly, of the organization in a year that really went south. He had a really nice season. He hit the crap out of the ball for Memphis, a 951 OPS, had a 500 slugging percentage, 10 home runs and 375 plate appearances down there. So not as much of a home run guy necessarily, but still good batting average at 297, huge on-base numbers. He had a 451 on base in AAA. And those numbers are way better than the numbers that Ivan Herrera had in 2022. He was a 770 OPS, so he raised his OPS 150 points year over year in AAA, which seemed to have an impact on the cup of coffee that he got in the big leagues as well. When he got a little chance with the Cardinals in 2022, he hit 111 with a 302 OPS. That's not sustainable. That's not playable at the big league level. In St. Louis this year, though, when he had 44 plate appearances, kind of a similar sample size, a little bit more opportunity, but still a small sample, 297 average, same as he had in Memphis, 409 on base, not much of a slugger with a 351. But like Yadier Molina wasn't much of a slugger either, and he could get on base to an extent, but he was a great batting average, great contact guy. Ivan Herrera with a 761 OPS in a small sample this past year, which was higher than Andrew Knizner, and the raw tools and materials for a former top prospect are certainly there for Ivan Herrera. So I think the Cardinals have got to kind of figure out what they want to do there. Having 3 catchers on the 40-man roster you can do. Having 3 on the active Major League roster you probably can't do. And do the Cardinals decide that it's a time for a shift in the road where they'll either trade Andrew Knizner or trade Ivan Herrera? Because I think you'll get more for Ivan Herrera. People around the game could see him as a bona fide starting backstop that could be one of the better catchers in baseball. I think that is an upside that Ivan Herrera possesses. And it's just a question of how the Cardinals want to proceed. But the $2 million or so salary you project for Andrew Knizner, I don't think is such that you would non-tender him. But maybe to clear a spot, you could trade somebody either this week or later on in the offseason because you know the Cardinals are going to bring in pitchers. They're signing guys. So that's going to be some roster spots that you need, not only because of Tuesday's deadline to maybe protect some guys, which, like I said, maybe not as many guys are going to go protected as I thought there should be. I'd certainly protect the pitchers, and I would be willing to take some position players off the 40-man in order to do it, because pitching is what this team needs. They don't need another middle infielder who's a quad A player. Maybe that guy pans out and helps your offense, but let's keep the focus on what needs to be focused on, right? But we'll see. I think one way that they could look to clear a spot could potentially be at the catcher position down the road. They may also take one more year and say, let's make sure we really trust Wilson Contreras. Show us one more year. Show us maybe some of the improvements where there's not a moment in this 6-month season where you get benched from the catcher position, which, again, wasn't as much on Wilson as I think it was on the Cardinal pitchers and the expectations they had, and the team maybe feeling they had a mutiny on their hands and like, okay, we're going to have to act here. Which, again, if you were going to look back to last season, should you have placated the pitchers who sucked all year, or should you have placated your new $87.5 million catcher who was probably more to blame for the problems? I think I know who was probably more to blame for the problems. And a little easier to say that because the majority of the rotation from last year is gone, and it is what it is. Like, the season is in the books. If someone doesn't like me saying that, well, they can look at the numbers, and that'll be what it is, right? I mean, Jordan Montgomery went on to be really successful elsewhere, but he was successful with the Cardinals. He wasn't really the issue with the rotation. We know that Wainwright just was injured all year and just didn't have any gas in the tank. I think it was mostly the injury that hurt him, now that we know kind of the shoulder stuff that he was dealing with. And Jack Flaherty, was very inconsistent, probably at the forefront of some of the issues with Contreras based on the tea leaves that we had coming out at the time. And he proceeded to not make the postseason rotation for the Orioles. So, again, if you wanted to look back and go, maybe what was going on there, I think, yeah, you can probably find where to point the finger, and it wouldn't be Wilson Contreras to the extent that it happened. So that's my take, which means that you're probably going to get a more calm second season as it pertains to Contreras. And again, I think it can help to have Yachty around, not because he is some terrible catcher, talking about Wilson, but just because why wouldn't you want to be able to learn from a guy that you idolize and certainly has a lot of knowledge about the game? But if the Cardinals want one more year to just make sure that they feel comfortable with where they are as an organization at the catcher spot, and maybe have one more year, because, again, injuries can happen, and it's better to have 3 good players than 2 at a position. Does it kind of suck for Ivan Herrera that maybe he ends up in a spot where he doesn't make the major league team out of camp if they have all 3 catchers? Yes. You could also go another direction if you really say, hey, Wilson's going to catch about half the time, but he's also going to DH. He's also maybe going to play a little first base this year. Because if Paul Goldschmidt doesn't get extended in spring training, you do also have to think about what that position looks like beyond 2024. I do think it would benefit the Cardinals to extend him, but I also understand that they could be looking at his decline in production and saying, is now the best time to give him another bag of guaranteed money? Or are we looking at a Matt Carpenter situation where we don't have to do it yet? We can play it out and certainly beat any offer that comes in on Paul Goldschmidt in free agency, or agree to a deal with him within the week period that you have after the 2024 World Series to have an exclusive window to negotiate with your own players. Maybe that's the way you go about it. The Cardinals historically, when it's been a guy that they want to make sure stays a Cardinal for life, a lot of times they try to do those extensions early. However, we did see with Yachty and Waino both, it came down to, those 1-year deals at the end. And there's no bigger Cardinal legends than Yachty and Waino. So as much as we all love Paul Goldschmidt, I think the Cardinals, if they really want to be on the prudent side, right? We always use that word. Mosaic uses that word. You could say, hey, Goldie, we love you. Let's let this play out. But do you run the risk of a player getting upset by, the team showing the lack of appreciation? The player always is willing to bet on himself. But in Goldschmidt's case, might he be most comfortable kind of looking down the years and saying, all right, this is how many more years I'd like to play. Can I just get this contract done so I'm a Cardinal to the end? It's a little interesting because Goldie was not a Cardinal at the beginning of his career, but now it feels like he's been here forever and is the embodiment of what the Cardinals are all about. I think he is very important in that clubhouse. I don't think that should be underestimated. A year where the Cardinals win a bunch of games and lose all of that clubhouse presence in Yachty and Albert, and then you say, oh, it's going to be fine, and then it's not fine. I think it does kind of lend to, man, the clubhouse guys that you do still have, how important is it to keep them and lock them up? But I bring that up because if the Cardinals decided to have 3 catchers on the roster, that there's a way that it could work. It just is going to be some minimal playing time. And do they view Ivan Herrera as a guy that needs that everyday seasoning still. I don't think he does. I don't think he has anything left to prove in AAA, and the team might be better to have him and Kisner both on your bench, and then you can feel like using them as pinch hitters, right? That's a bench question. Do you have an extra outfielder or an extra infielder, or would you rather say we want that punch off the bench toward the end of a game where we know Andrew Kisner can kill lefties, and if we need to burn a pinch hitter or do something here or there, we can then bring in a third catcher to be a defensive replacement. It's kind of what they were doing with Tres Barrera for a little bit last year, and it was obnoxious because there was no reason to have him on the roster. They weren't using him. But I think in the case of Ivan Herrera and Andrew Kisner, you could find ways to use both because they're both major league caliber players. So maybe that's a way the Cardinals go. Long story short, which is always a phrase I find myself saying because I tell long stories, but I wanted to be as complete in my analysis of this as I could be. I don't think the Cardinals are non-tendering Kisner. That's technically still what we're talking about. The non-tender candidates from this team. Andrew Kisner, to me, isn't really one that makes a lot of sense. But on the pitching side, there's only 3 Cardinals listed here, and there's a couple of the names that are on the pitching side, whereas Kisner was the only position player. 2 pitchers that are non-tender candidates, according to MLB Trade Rumors. Dakota Hudson, projected for $3.7 million, and Jake Woodford, projected for $1.1 million in salary for the upcoming season. This is where it gets interesting. Non-tender deadline is Friday. To me, and I love the guy, so I'm not trying to rip anybody, but from a roster perspective, to me, it would make sense for the Cardinals to find Dakota Hudson a home by Friday via trade. You could non-tender him, but surely there's a team that would find the value in Dakota Hudson as their number 5 starter, a team that's not all too competitive or hasn't been competitive, but they're looking to get some stabilization. I think for those types of teams, and the Cardinals, you could say, are right in that boat because, well, they won 71 games. What makes the Cardinals think they're too good for Dakota? They have to have higher aspirations, I think, to fix the pitching than Dakota as the number 5. Last offseason, I think, was a big one for Hudson. Another year removed from his Tommy John surgery. 2022 didn't go his way, and it was a question of, okay, what's going to have to give in order to believe in this player and see him turn the corner in the ways that the Cardinals wanted to see, to kind of recommit to him for the future. In 2022, Dakota Hudson threw 139 innings. So he logged the innings. He had a 4.45 ERA. It was by far the worst ERA of his career, but still you could say 4.45 was about half of Adam Wainwright's ERA. So you could always be worse. What's so wrong with just rolling with Dakota Hudson? Here is the number to circle when it comes to Dakota Hudson's 2022, and then it was basically replicated last year. 78 strikeouts in 139 innings is a K rate of 5.0. This was 2022. 5 strikeouts per 9 innings. Yeah, it's very low. We want to see about a K per inning. And if you can be above that, then you're the kind of guy that the Cardinals are targeting to be a relief ace in their bullpen or toward the top of their rotation. Those are the kind of guys the Cardinals are seeking. Dakota in 2022 had a 5 strikeout per 9 rate. Now, the offseason, can Dakota Hudson change his game, adjust, find a little more swing and miss, not have to be as reliant on pitch to contact, which he had been his entire career. He's a sinker baller. It does work for him when you have an elite infield defense behind you. But here's the reality about where the St. Louis Cardinals are right now. In 2021 and 2022, they were raking in Gold Glove nominees, even going back to 2020. And across the infield, I believe in 2021, they had Arenado, Goldschmidt, and Tommy Edman, I think that year was the second baseman. And DeYoung was playing shortstop for the most part, so pretty good defensively. The bottom line is the Cardinals had 1 Gold Glove nominee or finalist this year. It was Tommy as a utility player, and he ended up in center field to finish the season. So the defense infield-wise just is not as much of an advantage. When you are prioritizing offense by putting Nolan Gorman at second base, he's not a bad second baseman, but you almost need an elite one defensively in order to get Dakota Hudson's numbers where you want him to be. And he's got to pitch as well as he did previously, and I think there's been a little bit of a drop-off as well in that regard. But you also, I think, largely, if you're just going to distill it down to one thing, the FIP caught up to Dakota Hudson when the defense stopped being otherworldly on the Cardinals' infield defense. And Arenado, I think, is still great, but he had a bad start to the season, and that kind of, it cost him the Gold Glove. For the first time in his career, Arenado did not win the Gold Glove in the NL at third base this year. Goldschmidt's numbers, the metrics did not like Goldschmidt's defense this past season. I mentioned Gorman. Shortstop was kind of a revolving door. You didn't have the consistency. Hopefully Mason Wynn is the guy that locks that down for years to come, but he's got to figure out the offense relative to what he did at the end of last season. I'm not saying he can't do that, but it's a reality of what is going to happen for the Cardinals to trust him with the everyday role at shortstop. But you look at Dakota Hudson, I always would have Dakota Hudson's back. If you listen to B. Schaeffer Daily over the years, I would say, look, his FIP doesn't matter because he's a ground ball pitcher and he's got the best infield defense in baseball. I don't care in 2019 that his FIP is 4.93, fielding independent pitching. Yes, it's bad that he leads the league in walks as a pitch-to-contact pitcher in 2019. That's not what you want. But the ERA of 3.35, the reason it worked was because the Cardinals had infield defense that you could trust. 2020 was the same thing, a 2.77 ERA before he got injured toward the end of the season and had the Tommy John. But it was a similar story. The FIP was 4.5. In 2022, his FIP was 4.34. So actually better than the two previous years he had spent as a starter. The problem was the infield defense in 2022 took a bit of a dive, and it didn't get any better in 2023. That cost Dakota Hudson. Finally, his ERA was lining up with what his fielding independent pitching was because the Cardinals were more average as a defensive unit on the infield. Then 2023, it was like, okay, how can you adjust as a pitcher, come in ready? We heard all of these great things from Dakota about his relationship with Dusty Blake, and he really liked the direction everything was heading. He gets to spring training. I can remember it like it was yesterday. I'm on the backfields. I'm in the dugout on these backfields. They're really nice fields, but the vibe is more like a Sandlot vibe. Like your 12-year-old kid playing baseball, the Ozzie Smith complex right behind my house here in O'Fallon. It's just those chain link dugouts, and you're right there in front of the action. So I'm standing in the dugout watching the first live BP session of the spring, Dakota Hudson. And I don't even remember who the hitters were. I think it was the big guns, like the Arenados, the Goldschmidts of the world. It was bad. He couldn't throw strikes. He didn't look comfortable. And they didn't even have a pitch clock on him. And I talked about it that day on B. Schaeffer Daily. And I said, guys, didn't look good for Dakota today. And from there, it just wasn't a good Grapefruit League. It wasn't a good spring for Dakota Hudson. He wasn't different. There was a lot of hope that he would be different. He didn't have the command, the sharpness that he needed. And so as a result, he spent the first half of the year in AAA in 2023. And then when he came up, it was sort of out of necessity after the white flag had been waved. They put him in the rotation to all right, we'll give him a shot to see if he can show something. Identical. His production was basically identical to 2022. ERA plus of 88 in both seasons, which means 12% below league average. The FIP actually went up to a career worst 5.06. Now, smaller sample, but still 81 innings, 4.89 ERA. I don't think Dakota Hudson's got a role on the Cardinals in 2024 based on what we saw. And even as a depth pitcher, you can respect that what he brings to the table, it's probably not going to be worse than a 5 ERA because he's never had a 5 ERA. Even last year, it was 4.98. Even in 2022, it was 4.45. So, that's passable as a number 7 starter that if you have some injuries, you bring him in and you say he's going to at least give you some competitive innings because, Adam Wainwright was not competitive last year. But granted, he was injured. So, as far as a healthy pitcher goes, it doesn't feel like the upside is great unless you have a great infield defense behind you. So there are teams that I think Dakota Hudson could go to and probably benefit from, and maybe the Cardinals could end up having that infield defense again with Mason Wynn, especially if they bring Tommy Edman to second base or Brendan Donovan even as the regular second baseman. I think you could really have something again with the Cardinals infield defense. They would have to probably trade Gorman for that to happen. I'm not advocating for or against that. It depends on what they get. We've talked about that already in the offseason. We know they need starting pitching. But when it comes to Dakota Hudson, I just don't think the Cardinals have a rotation spot for him. And beyond that, are you going to spend $3.7 million, which is the projected salary, on a guy that's a break glass in case a couple of injuries happen to your rotation? I know that today the Cardinals don't have the pitchers to say we can get rid of Dakota Hudson, but they have to gamble a little bit on the fact that they've got one job this offseason, and that's to fix the rotation. So to me, you trade Dakota Hudson this week. And if not, you do consider the non-tender, because I think that $3.7 million can be used elsewhere in a more effective way. I would love to see Dakota Hudson go to a team that's maybe not a strong hitting team, but they've got sound defense, and he can go there and see if he can kind of reinvent himself a little bit, but still use the tenets that made him successful early in his career. I like Dakota Hudson so much. I want him to do well. I don't think it's in their best interest to have him being paid $3.7 million for 2024 and not be part of the rotation. I'm just not sure it makes sense. If they think they can turn him into a reliever that can do some of the stuff that he did when he first came up in 2018, okay, but even then he wasn't really striking many guys out. He's never had a strikeout rate in his career higher than 7.2 Ks per nine, and that was the 2020 COVID season when he was at his best, and then he got hurt. 7.2 is the career high for Dakota Hudson. Let me show you some stats here. This past season, I'm looking at qualified pitchers in Major League Baseball. The lowest K rate in baseball was 6.08. Jordan Lyles among qualifying starting pitchers. Second lowest in Major League Baseball, 6.12. A name that should be familiar, Miles Mikolas. So if you're the Cardinals, can you afford to have two of those guys that aren't striking people out? And again, Dakota Hudson's was 5.0 in 2022. It was 5.0 in 2023. Nothing changed. Identical Ks per nine. And Dakota was not a qualifying starter, didn't have enough innings. But of all the pitchers that did qualify, he was a full K per nine lower than the worst one. And Miles Mikolas was second worst in the league. And I say worst because it is a stat. I'm not going to say lowest. It's worst. That's bad. To not strike out batters is bad. It is the way that Miles Mikolas has to pitch. It informs what conversation I had with Benjamin Hockman and Ollie Marmol on the field late in the season, just saying, hey, Mikolas, the FIP isn't so bad for him. What do you think happened? Well, he doesn't strike out a lot of guys, and sometimes there can be variance there. Yup, that's what happened to Miles Mikolas. It's not sustainable, though, to not have swing and miss. Mikolas, I think, can make it work because I think he's got a little bit more juice to what he does as a pitcher than Dakota Hudson. I also think that Mikolas' K rate was lower this past year than it had been. Mikolas normally around 6.5 to 7. It was 6.1. That's kind of a negligible difference, though. Mikolas got bit by bad luck. He still had a much better FIP, though, than Dakota did. You can't have two guys, though, is the bottom line, that are doing that. And if I make it 100, this is great. If I make it 100 innings, just say minimum 100 innings last year, still Dakota doesn't meet that threshold, so we might have to make it 80 so we can see where he would rank. Minimum 100 innings, the lowest K rate in MLB, Adam Wainwright, 4.90. So you've got now two Cardinals pitchers that made up a bulk of the rotation just at the very bottom of baseball in swing and miss. And if you add it, make the minimum playing time 80 innings, lowest in baseball, still Adam Wainwright, 4.90. Second worst in baseball, Dakota Hudson at 4.98 Ks per nine. So the 5 was actually rounding up. So you have 100 innings from Adam Wainwright, 81 innings from Dakota Hudson, and 200 innings from Miles Mikolas, who ranks 13th from the bottom of all MLB pitchers that threw at least 80 innings last year. 3 of your 5 rotation spots, essentially, which I know that maybe Wainwright and Dakota just combined for 1 rotation spot, but that's almost 400 innings of the worst K rate in baseball. That's how the Cardinals did what they did last year. Combined, I mean, if you were to have a thesis statement for how the Cardinals struggled so badly last year, it's they had 3 pitchers at the very bottom of the barrel in all of Major League Baseball in Ks per nine. that made up almost 400 innings of their season, combined with a season where infield defense went down the crapper. That's the whole thing. That's the whole thing. And I know we can say the offense was inconsistent and you need to do this offensively. That is the whole thing. You can distill the season down to what I just said. I've never even looked at it like this, but it should be obvious for as much as we talk about Ks per nine mattering. Wainwright, worst in baseball of all the pitchers who had 80 or more innings. Dakota Hudson, second worst in baseball of all the pitchers with 80 or more innings. Miles Mikolas, who threw more innings than anybody, 13th from the bottom in baseball. You figure there are, I guess I don't have to figure. I can tell you how many pitchers in baseball threw at least 80 innings. 172 of them did. The Cardinals had, of those guys, 3 of the bottom 13 in the very 2 worst in MLB in K rate. That's how you get a season like you had when you combine it with infield defense not being as strong as it had been in previous years. It is no more complicated than that, to be honest with you. And so what do? You replace Wainwright's rotation spot with a guy who does strike batters out. You replace Dakota Hudson with a guy who does strike batters out, and you hope that Miles Mikolas has better luck this time. Like, that's what you do. Or you also mentioned infield defense as a priority, which, again, if we're talking about an offseason master plan for the St. Louis Cardinals, it's not comfortable to say, but you trade Nolan Gorman to get one of those pitchers. If you're serious about, and you're of the mindset that I am, that the reason the Cardinals were bad last year was the couple of sentences that I just gave. 3 of the bottom 13 in Major League Baseball of everyone who threw 80 innings in K rate. An infield defense that was subpar. Gorman is not a bad defender at second base, but I think and again, Tommy Edman made a lot of errors at second too. So I think the other part of it is decide where somebody's going to play to the extent that it's possible to do so. You had a lot of guys moving around positions. Can you tell Tommy Edman from day one, you're the second baseman because we're signing Kevin Kiermaier, or we're going to go Dylan in center, or we're going to sign Cody Bellinger? Like, I legitimately think almost as important as fixing the K rate in your rotation and having 2 bona fide starters at the top of it, I think getting that infield defense aligned with what you want to do in the outfield and have everybody feel comfortable where they're playing could be an underappreciated key to this entire thing. Tommy Edman, I think if he comes in as the second baseman, I think he probably is back to Gold Glove caliber at second base. And I know he can play around the diamond and does a nice job of it. He was a finalist at the utility spot because of what he can do at various positions. But second base, he just made kind of some bonehead errors last year. It wasn't like that he couldn't physically do the position. It was just a couple of plays from here and there. You can remember the one against San Francisco. Ball just gets through on him. That's just I don't know what it is, but Tommy Edman's better than that. I would give Tommy a chance to, unless he's your center fielder, which go ahead and make him your center fielder every day then. Give the guy the opportunity. I know he can have that flexibility. Pick a guy that's going to be that guy for your team, and if it's Brendan Donovan, I think that's fine, because I think he's good in the corner outfields. I think he's good at second base. I think he's good at third base, and I think your roster is in a spot where you can have him be flexible and everything works out. But if you had an everyday second baseman to go with an everyday shortstop, and hopefully Mason Wynn can hit, because if he can, he's going to be an upgrade defensively. The Cardinals can get back to being the Cardinals, and you add K rate. That's why there is belief that this team can turn it around in one off season. But you have to put the puzzle pieces in the right spots to do it. And I think infield defense is an underrated part of that. And because Nolan Gorman might have the value to get you Logan Gilbert, I'm not saying he does for sure. I don't know what the Mariners want. They probably prefer Donovan because they've talked about valuing contact. But I wonder if you can get a bona fide stud for Gorman, if that's the thing that makes the most sense, because it allows everything else to align. Or you say, no, we're not going to be that pitch-to-contact staff anymore, and we're just going to lean so heavily in on strikeout rate and get guys that can do that we don't necessarily need to have infield defense be as much of a priority. But if you go that route, don't sign Sonny Gray, because he's he's 1K per inning kind of guy. He's 9 per 9. Go get Aaron Nola. Go trade for Tyler Glass now. Go sign Blake Snell. Like, if you're serious about it, I think that's the alignment that I need to do a full podcast on. Like, this is why I do a stream of consciousness show, because I talk and talk, and then I stumble upon things where I go, wait a minute, I think that's the ticket. You look at the guys the Cardinals could potentially sign. If you want to sign Sonny Gray, I think you can do that, and you think you can be effective. I think it's probably aligned with something that would say Gorman would be the guy that you trade if you sign Sonny Gray. Gorman would be the guy that you trade for a pitcher. If you sign Blake Snell and trade for Tyler Glasnow, which will not cost you Gorman, yes, you might have a little bit of an innings concern on those guys staying healthy, but their K rates are through the moon. I keep saying that. Is it through the moon or through the roof? Over the moon, through the roof. I got to get my analogies right. But I guess the best way I can make this a more simpler statement is the more robust K rate that you come up with in the pitchers they acquire for the rotation, the more you can afford to stick by Nolan Gorman and say we're going to go all in on power and not as much defense. But if you want to be Sonny Gray where you live, because he's not as much of a K rate guy, even Aaron Nola had good K rate above 9 per 9. I think he had 200 strikeouts and 190 innings. But even that's not like Blake Snell levels or Tyler Glasnow levels. So at that point, if you go with the more probably affordable Sonny Gray, or like we mentioned Marcus Stroman on Twitter the other day, he's not a big K guy. If you don't get the K rate that you need, I think it becomes all the more important to not trade Tommy or Brendan Donovan and to prioritize defense and say maybe Gorman's the guy that you have to move to get one more of those pitchers. That's really an interesting kind of concept. What do you think about that, Cardinals fans? Let me know if you're tracking or if I need to flesh this idea out a little bit better in a future podcast. Because before we get up to the hour mark that I'm going to try to generally make my limit, about an hour, I want to talk about Jake Woodford a little bit. But the reasoning, I think, behind Dakota Hudson, I think a lot of people understand that I just don't think he's got a role. And so find him a home, I think, would be the most fair thing to do. But the Cardinals could ultimately decide to non-tender him, which loss of value because I think he can be a major league pitcher. But at some point, you have to say, is this the money that we're necessarily looking to spend? Jake Woodford going to make probably a little more than $1 million in his first year of arbitration. He had a 6.3 or 2.3 ERA last year in the big leagues. I think this one is pretty cut and dried. You probably do non-tender him. You know, I know it was a limited sample that they got from him. He had good numbers in the minors, 2.83 ERA this season in the minors, but he didn't spend a lot of time down there. And he was mostly the break glass in case of emergency long man in St. Louis. He made a handful of starts, 47 innings, 29 strikeouts. That's a Dakota Hudson-like rate of 5.5 Ks per 9. Had a better K rate in the minors, but he always has. And then he comes up and just, it doesn't replicate. That's true over the last couple of seasons for Woody. I just think at this point, the roster spot is probably more valuable for somebody that you think may, like, if you're looking at it this week and you're going, Tuesday at 5 p.m., we got to protect Sem Robertson or Adam Kloffenstein. Do those guys stand a better chance to help your rotation in the future than does Jake Woodford? I think so. The 1.1 million projection is not huge. They could keep him around. And that's another thing that's going to be interesting because if the Cardinals don't add all of the pitching depth that they know they need, you know, they got to decide right now on Jake Woodford whether to offer him a contract. They got to decide right now on Dakota Hudson. It would be bad to get rid of both of those guys and then just sign nobody or only get one pitcher. And it's like, shoot, we thought we could get more guys. So I think you have to kind of reverse engineer it a little bit. John Mozeliak's just got to trust in what's going to happen this offseason, that, like, if it comes down to overpaying for replacement level pitching, we're going to have to do it. Because I don't think paying the $1 million to Woodford is necessarily what they're going to look to do. I could be wrong. You know, $1 million is just a, you know, $250K more than what he had been making as a year 0 to 2 service time guy. But I don't think Jake Woodford has a future in the rotation. He seemed to be kind of out of place in the bullpen. If they could figure out a way to turn him into a short distance reliever, one inning, and see what kind of velocity you can get out of him, and maybe he could thrive in that role. But they've never really given him a chance to use him in that role, so I just don't really know. But the money is not as much of an impediment as it is for Dakota Hudson. I think that's the one that you go, it's going to be $3.5–4 million that Dakota Hudson makes. Is that something that you can really justify for a guy who's at best, like, you go in and he's your number 6 starter? I don't think they're going to be in a spot where he's in their opening day rotation, barring several injuries. So I think in just terms of the embodiment of what the Cardinals are wanting to prioritize when they go out in the trade market and they go out in free agency, they're looking for K rate. Dakota is the bottom of the barrel in K rate. Not to oversimplify it, but I think that's kind of what leads you to thinking that maybe they move on from him. And I think in the case of Jake Woodford, you can make a similar argument, but he's going to make a lot less money and in a similar spot. If Hudson and Woodford are going to be similar players, one's making a third of the money, you maybe keep that guy if you're worried about the depth. But Dakota, I would be very interested to see if there's a market to trade for him. Don't worry about what you get for him. I think it's mostly finding him a home that's like a good fit for him would be the benefit. But for the Cardinals, I'm just not sure. The bottom line is, yeah, you're going to send him a contract where you're going to owe him close to $4 million to, unless they have some real belief that something's going to change this offseason, I'm just not sure if he's going to be back. And I hate to say that because I like Dakota Hudson a lot, but I think with where the Cardinals are, some hard decisions are going to have to get made at some point, and maybe this is the offseason in which they realize that they've just got to move in maybe a different direction. You had 2023, like if 2023 was truly the season that we build it as for Dakota, which is like this is going to be a big year to prove that he can get back to the good production that he had earlier on before Tommy John, and then it goes the way that it went for him, ERA of 4.98, a FIP even higher when he pitched 80 innings in the Cardinals big league team, 6.0 ERA in Memphis, a WHIP near 2 in Memphis. Like, if it was truly an important season for him, I don't think he passed the test. Unfortunately, I just think that's the way that this one ends up having to go. But let me know what you think, Cardinals fans. Chime into the comments section here on YouTube with your thoughts. Obviously, by the time you listen to this, we may know who some of the non-tenders are, or more likely we'll know who some of the outrighted off the 40-man guys are if the Cardinals want to protect anybody new. So Tuesday night, you'll be able to listen to it Wednesday morning. We'll react to what does or doesn't happen for the Cardinals at the Rule 5 protection deadline. Names I'm watching include James Nail, Packy Naughton. I think Riley O'Brien is probably safe, the new reliever that they traded for just a couple of weeks ago. Connor Thomas, Guillermo Zuniga, Jake Woodford. Not really keying in on Andrew Kisner. Luken Baker, Jose Fermin, Buddy Kennedy, they just brought in. Same with Jared Young, so be surprised to see those guys cut. Moises Gomez, Michael Ciani, Juan Yepes. Some names that we'll see what happens with them this week, but you could see maybe a number of those guys as expendable via trade or outright situations off the 40-man. Let me know what you think, though, Cardinals fans, about this situation. It could be a big week for the Cardinals. We'll continue to follow it here on Be Safe Daily. And before I get out of here, quick reminder that if you like the idea of a Discord, if you're familiar with Discord and you think, yeah, we should have one so that Cardinals fans and listeners of the show and the channel can react and respond to everything going on with the team during the season and the offseason, keep sending me your messages. A number of you have sent me a message, but if you haven't yet, and it would be something you'd like interest or you'd have interested in joining, send me a message at bschaefer12. I'm on Twitter. Thank you guys so much for listening, and we'll talk to you next time on Be Safe Daily. Peace.